Okay, I'll get things underway. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along for this Climate Action Beacon webinar. I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm on Kombumerri Yugambeh country here on the Gold Coast campus of Griffith University, and paying my respect to elders past and present, and also just taking a moment to reflect for you also on the country that you're on, and those relations that First Nations people have to this place we now call Australia, and how that might inform and perhaps and definitely help in terms of our responses to climate changes, and what we might learn from the knowledge and the expertise of First Nations people in Australia, and today, because we have a scholar from Canada, in First Nations people all over the world. So paying my respects, but also expressing a very deep sense of gratitude that I'm fortunate enough to share that cultural heritage, which is so spectacular in Australia. So thank you to all First Nations people present. So if you don't know, in case you don't know me, my name's Kerry Foxwell-Norton. I'm an Associate Professor of Environmental and Climate Change Communication here at Griffith University, and I'm also a leader in the Climate Action Beacon. The Climate Action Beacon is a strategic research initiative of Griffith University that's enabled us to bring researchers from all over the university into a single focus. So our role as a Climate Action Beacon has been to support researchers throughout the university in their various research centres, and to, I guess, have that sort of bird's eye view of what everyone's doing, and in acknowledgement that there's that climate change is a wicked problem, being able to bring together diverse disciplines in a transdisciplinary exchange, so that we can tackle this the challenge of climate change in recognition that this is new for all of us. So trying to find solutions through innovative partnerships and bringing different people together. So the climate action, this is a webinar today is a Climate Action Beacon webinar. There's another one on next month, which will be delivered by the Performance and Ecology Research Lab at Griffith University, a team of researchers who are recently successful with their ARC, Australian Research Council linkage. So a big congratulations to Tanya Beer and her team on getting that ARC linkage up. It's a wonderful achievement. But today, we're going to be listening to Dr. Hanna Morris. Hanna is from the University of Toronto in Canada, and despite my offer to introduce Hanna has explained that she introduces you to her work in a far more substantial way than I ever possibly could. So Hanna today will be talking about, Hanna, the title of your presentation today is Climate Authoritarianism.
Apocalyptic Authoritarianism.
Apocalyptic Authoritarianism. But I'll pass over to Hanna I'm actually going to roll to stage right so that Hanna can present to you today. I hope you enjoy it. Over to you, Hanna. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just roll on over here. So thank you so much, Kerry. And thank you all for being here. I'm really looking forward to talking to you all a bit about some of my work and my forthcoming book project in particular. So I'm just going to share my screen. All right. Let me just try one thing. Can you see my notes or no notes?
No notes.
No notes? All right, awesome. Thank you for sticking with me on that. I always panic when technology goes wrong. But okay, thank you so much. And thank you, Natasha, for all of your help with organizing today's talk. And Kerry, a huge thank you for inviting me to speak and for all of your support of my work throughout the years. I really appreciate it a lot. So today I am going to talk to you all a bit about some of my work. And I find that it's always helpful knowing who a speaker is and where they're coming from in terms of their background and approach to research, So I want to start off today with a little bit about where I'm coming from and how I think about both climate journalism, the topic of my new book, which I'll talk about in a minute, so don't worry, and climate change communication research more generally. So I have a PhD in communication with expertise in critical cultural studies and climate change. And I currently work in an interdisciplinary environmental studies department at the University of Toronto as an assistant professor, and consider myself to be an interdisciplinary scholar who integrates not only perspectives from communication studies and environmental studies, but also from political theory and social theory into my work. My work specifically concentrates on the climate, media, democracy nexus and explores questions of power, identity formation, and meaning making around climate change. I've recently written about environmental social movements, social media, climate art, and climate journalism, always with an eye to power and a focus on how and why certain ways of representing climate change have come to be, and how these modes of representation shape and influence the types of responses that are proposed or not to address the disparate threats and impacts of climate change. Put differently, I'm interested in how the causes, risks, and proposed responses to climate change are conceptualized, communicated, and contested across different cultural, political, and social contexts, and importantly, to what end. As an interpretive, interdisciplinary social scientist who uses critical and qualitative methods of inquiry, I take context very seriously. Across my work, I seek to understand the contingency of certain ways of knowing and how regimes of truth, borrowing this phrase from Michel Foucault, came to be and are challenged or maintained. So, as a critical scholar attuned to questions of truth, identity, and power, there has been a lot to pay attention to and try to make sense of over the past handful of years. Researchers of social change often refer to particularly influential ruptures or events in historical time as critical junctures, or in the words of Claude Levi-Strauss, hot moments. The year 2016 in the US, where I am from and was living at the time, certainly felt sweltering, and the heat hasn't come close to letting up. This heat, of course, I mean metaphorically to describe the intense turmoil brought about with Donald Trump's victory in the presidential election that year. But also I mean it quite literally too, with the steady rise in destructive wildfires, storms, and flooding intensified by climate change. This literal heating coincided with the metaphorical inferno of Trump's presidency, of which David Remnick describes here in this New Yorker article on my slide here, following Trump's 2016 election as a moment of revulsion and profound anxiety. This was a hot moment when a sense of self as a nation incinerated and a desperate search for American identity and so-called return to normalcy became commonplace across op-eds, commentaries, and editorials in the US press. For US journalists in the latter half of the 2010s, the immediate, as opposed to far-off impacts of climate change were becoming increasingly apparent at the very same time as the risks of anti-democratic politics and anti-journalistic fervor were too, following the election of Trump in 2016, a man who refers to the US press as the enemy of the people. So not only were American journalists trying to wrap their heads around the shocking election of an illiberal president who stoked hatred and division, but they were also trying to defend their right to exist as a free and independent press, all the while grappling with how to cover a world literally burning around them. Indeed, the destructive floods in the UK, massive fires on the west coast of North America and in Australia, and deadly heat waves across Europe were occurring in tandem with the highly visible violence of white supremacy, misogyny, and xenophobia under the likes of Trump. It is quite notable and also quite understandable, considering these fraught and in many ways unprecedented contexts, that since 2016, the unfolding climate and democratic crises have in many ways been transposed upon each other and interpreted by wary journalists through a singular lens of total crisis, or apocalypse. Brad Plumer, a New York Times climate journalist, even refers to his climate beats as the apocalypse beat. An apocalyptic mood, or in the words of cultural studies scholar Raymond Williams, an apocalyptic structure of feeling, was and remains palpable across the US media landscape. This fire and brimstone image and narrative is clearly not anomalous, and neither is it, however, innocuous. Apocalyptic anxieties have melded together in very peculiar ways in American climate journalism, with concerning implications for more robustly democratic modes of governance and more rigorously nuanced reporting practices. The question of how these peculiar representations of climate change have come to be and to what consequence motivates my new book, entitled Apocalyptic Authoritarianism, Climate Crisis, Media, and Power, that will be released next year with Oxford University Press, and will also be the topic of my talk today. My book examines, and today I will discuss, how these apocalyptic anxieties following the 2016 presidential election of Donald Trump have shaped and continue to shape American journalistic interpretations of climate change in ways that severely limit how it has come to be known, imagined, and contended with by the US national press. To begin with, it is incredibly significant that there was an unprecedented surge in climate media attention during these years of such profound political and social turmoil. The year 2019 is an especially important moment. This was 3 years into the Trump presidency, and also the year when a verifiable climate beat gained substantial traction for the first time in the US. Editorial boards across the country committed to the Covering Climate Now initiative, co-founded by the Columbia Journalism Review and The Nation, in association with The Guardian and WNYC, a local radio in New York, in 2019. Covering Climate Now was in part a response to the pronounced and sustained attack on both climate science and journalism from a Trump White House. Through this new initiative, major media outlets within the US promised to dedicate the resources, personnel, time, and attention required to produce more climate change reporting amid worsening environmental and political conditions. Reflective of this commitment, the Media and Climate Change Observatory at the University of Colorado at Boulder found that newspaper coverage of climate change was up 73% in 2019 compared to 2018, just 1 year prior. Within this milieu of increased news coverage, there was also a parallel spike in climate themes across popular culture. Trending musicians such as Billie Eilish sang about the climate apocalypse, and the writers of hit American shows like Big Little Lies developed plot lines around kids' climate anxieties. Oxford Dictionaries even named the climate emergency its 2019 word of the year, and had an all climate-related shortlist, including climate action, climate denial, and eco-anxiety. Moreover, the majority of Americans in 2019 expressed that they were not only convinced that climate change was real, a question that quite notoriously lasted for far too long in the US, but that they were also both alarmed by the threats of climate change and wanted to do something about it. This was a striking moment of change. For so many years prior to 2019, climate communication and journalism scholars were largely concerned with how to accurately and effectively communicate and translate the science so as to raise widespread public concern and encourage robust climate action. But now people were concerned. The attention was there. Public awareness, interest, and a motivated desire for comprehensive action were all evident in the US for the first time. Americans wanted radical change. And yet, the ultimate direction that climate journalism would take stifled as opposed to bolstered this incredible momentum. The journalistic treatment of young climate justice activists during this period of heightened national and climate concern in the post-2016 Trump hot moment is an illustrative example of how US news media dampened these prodigious calls for change. Notably, many of the most popular visions for how to effectively respond to climate change and the democratic crisis posed by Trump came from youth-led, and in particular, young women of color-led, climate justice groups and grassroots movements. These movements formed prior to 2019 in the US, before the media took serious note of climate change. Progressive climate activist coalitions like the Sunrise Movement began in 2017 in the wake of an alarming Trump election and built upon decades of community organizing, as did the development of the widely popular Green New Deal, which proposed a more inclusive and robust climate policymaking process that centered Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities who have been historically left out of federal climate conversations on Capitol Hill in the US. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a young progressive woman of color, ran with the Green New Deal as a core commitment during the 2018 congressional election, an election she would go on to win, ousting a long-standing Democratic Party figure and ushering in a more vibrant and hopeful vision for what American politics could look like amid a demoralizing Trump presidency. Eventually, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, along with Senator Edward Markey, filed the resolution for a Green New Deal with the U.S. Congress on February 7, 2019. Although the resolution ultimately did not pass, it nonetheless marked a key turning point in contemporary American climate politics by illustrating what an alternative identity and robustly democratic direction for the U.S. could look like. It cannot be underscored enough that this alternative identity and direction was incredibly popular across the U.S. populace at the time, according to multiple surveys. A reimagination of what U.S. politics could be, with climate justice and democratic decision-making at the center, inspired and united a diverse coalition of people who envisioned a future entirely distinct from the vitriol and violence of a reactionary Trump America. And yet, despite this movement building in momentum, prominent national news outlets failed to take note of its popular appeal. And when the media eventually did take note in 2019, reporters severely shortchanged the movement by inaccurately casting supporters of the Green New Deal as extremist, hysterical, and uncivil, radicalized young Black and brown women out of step with the desires and views of a so-called average American. Conversely, so-called moderate figures were positioned as the opposite of these so-called extremists and represented as stoic, far-seeing, and ingenious, as well as older and whiter, visionary sage figures capable of leading the US and the entire world out of today's apocalyptic total crisis. Accordingly, top-down technocratic and market mechanisms proposed by self-proclaimed visionary sages were and continue to be repeatedly featured in climate news stories as the only way forward to solve the total crisis of right now. These top-down mechanisms starkly differ from the more comprehensive and radically bottom-up proposals put forward by, for instance, the Green New Deal. A policy resolution that I mentioned had widespread public support across the political spectrum before it was picked up and disparaged by the US press in 2019. The national press, from the center-left New York Times to the center-right Wall Street Journal, reported on the Green New Deal as a threatening policy proposed by demagogic young radical Representative Ocasio-Cortez and her dangerously militant young followers. The Green New Deal and supporters were and still are demonized by national news media as threatening others in an apocalyptic present. It is clear that within the tumult of the 2016 US presidential election of Trump, there was and remains a notable longing for balance, stability, and a renewed sense of self as a nation through a clear demarcation of us versus them. The all-encompassing image of a total crisis and repeated fear-mongering of extremists across climate journalism, however, works in favor of a reactionary and anti-democratic political project. The image of civilizational collapse and a further loss of American prestige and power ushered in by threatening others closes off a more nuanced consideration of the many possible responses to climate change beyond a silver bullet technological or green capitalist solution. It is especially striking that Representative Ocasio-Cortez and young female supporters of color who advocate for the Green New Deal have been repeatedly singled out and represented as threatening to the US across both conservative and centrist media alike. The construction of a young, militant other has taken off more widely and visibly across climate journalism since further fuel was added to the perceived fire of total crisis when the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020. Within the chaos of a devastating pandemic, at the heels of a tumultuous Trump presidency, a regime of climate journalism has solidified around a binary that clearly distinguishes a moderate, older, whiter, visionary sage figure who is reported on as capable of putting the US and globe back on a stable path versus a militant climate justice activist who is portrayed as impeding this return to normalcy that the American people supposedly so desperately desire after years of upheaval. Alarmingly, publications like the New York Times and Democratic politicians like Sean Patrick Maloney, who bitterly lost the 2022 midterm election and blames young progressive like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for his loss, repeat and amplify Republican talking points and fearmonger about the so-called new left as a profound threat to the US nation state. My book reveals that it is through this othering and fear-mongering that a very concerning concretization of the boundaries around who should and who should not be included in climate decision-making processes and in American politics altogether is taking place across US journalistic and political discourse. Young female climate justice activists of color are clearly being othered and delegitimized as viable speaking subjects who should not be included in climate, party, or national deliberations. There's a growing consensus across the US national press, from the center to the right, that a woke or so-called new left is a destabilizing force that must be stopped. Conversely, traditionally privileged figures are centered and celebrated as visionary sages and the ultimate authorities who should be followed and who are singularly capable of bringing back national and planetary stability and so-called normalcy. The simultaneous disparagement of young progressive women of color, a historically marginalized group in the US, and glorification of older, whiter men, a historically advantaged group in the US, is consistent with wider patterns in American climate reporting following a tumult of the 2016 presidential election of Trump, and is definitive of what I refer to as apocalyptic authoritarianism. Fundamentally, apocalyptic authoritarianism describes the reactionary posturing and political alignment of historically privileged figures transcendent of the partisan center and right who are united through a common enemy of the new left and a shared appeal to apocalyptic fears of total crisis. Fear-mongering of a supposedly America-hating contingent of woke leftist radicals who are threatening the nation and impeding the earth-saving work of visionary sages is precisely where apocalyptic authoritarianism in the US hardens the line between us and them. There's little room for imagining dynamic subjectivities, identities, and alternative futures beyond the one supposedly fated path that is discursively sedimented within a strict dualism of right and wrong. The supreme authority of visionary sage figures is justified through their claimed singular capacity to shepherd the wayward masses back onto this one and only righteous path towards national recovery and stability. According to this reactionary logic, it is the job of traditional authorities and pro-American saviors to bring back order by eliminating all unruly others, leading the nation astray. My book critically examines how US climate journalism is bolstering apocalyptic authoritarianism as opposed to reckoning with the roots and ramifications of both climate change and the rising currents of anti-democratic politics. To be sure, comprehensive journalistic work is incredibly challenging and is only becoming more difficult with fewer jobs, less public support, and scant financial resources available for reporters. Clearly, journalists have been navigating extremely turbulent waters for quite some time now, with an unprecedented drop in public trust amid a long-term failure to financially adapt to the shifting tides of digital platforms and social media. Instead of changing course away from outmoded business models and an increasingly elite-oriented and inaccessible style of news, however, advocates of traditional journalism, which is the preferred phrase used by the publisher of the New York Times, A.G. Sulzberger, to describe well-established news outlets with professionally trained reporters, print editions in addition to online versions, and a national audience. So traditional journalism is buckling down on the old ways with fervor. But these old ways fall far short of what is required to contend with the technopolitical, environmental, and societal shifts of a post-2016 present. Traditional journalists are failing to grapple with the complexities of climate change and are deepening as opposed to investigating the false equivalencies, myths, and politics of othering that propel apocalyptic authoritarianism at the expense of more robustly democratic alternatives. Ultimately, apocalyptic anxieties during the age of Trump have shaped and continue to shape journalistic and political interpretations of climate change in ways that severely limit how it has come to be known, imagined, and contended with, both inside and outside of the newsroom. These anxieties and the reactionary responses to them are sculpting a new regime of climate journalism and politics. As a sort of Frankenstein's monster of reanimated national myths and memories, the US climate beat is becoming an amalgamation of categories and concepts They're not only outmoded, but also dangerously myopic and exclusionary. Notably, nostalgic memories of America's past are brought forward in climate news to provide a sense of direction amid this perceived total crisis. National myths of grandeur, exceptionalism, and dominion were reactivated within a nascent post-2016 climate beat that took definitive root in 2019. Significantly, there is an evident desire for a return to an imagined post-World War II golden age in U.S. news stories on climate change. It is not inconsequential that this romanticized period is also when historically privileged figures, including journalists writing for prominent national news outlets, were on more solid ground. This privilege is precisely what young social and climate justice activists are questioning, and also precisely what traditional centers of power are desperately trying to cling to, protect, and fortify. Indeed, calls to, quote, mobilize to defeat climate change and to, quote, win the war on warming across U.S. news headlines reflect a longing for a time when traditional authorities were imagined to have been more respected, and American centrality in global leadership were understood to be on much more solid ground. During and after World War II, United States official and media narratives cast other nations as unstable and either wrought by or at risk of social upheaval and extremism, and thus in need of saving by a supposedly superior American way of life, according to the nationalistic logic of the myth of American exceptionalism. With the corruption, violence, and instability of the Trump presidency, this idea of an exceptional America was shaken to the core. For many, at least. Again, within the fray of a rattled sense of self, post-2016 media accounts reflect a desperate search for American identity. Crucially, the search focuses in on a longing for a sense of balance in order to reassert the long-believed uniqueness of United States culture and values. This helps to explain why public and media discourse turned to the historical event of World War II, to call to the fore collective memories of times in the past when the U.S. is remembered to have demonstrated its so-called unique leadership during times of hardship. Jake Sullivan demonstrates this memory work in a special issue of Atlantic magazine published in early 2019 by claiming how, quote, for centuries, European states waged war with grim regularity. The fact that the major powers have not returned to war with one another since 1945 is a remarkable achievement of American statecraft, end quote. And this is, remember, written in 2019, so things have changed since then. These allusions to a glorified American past were brought forward to stoke rallying cries for, again, in the words of President Joe Biden's appointed National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, quote, a new American exceptionalism. Notably, the Biden presidency came to be represented as a profound opportunity for the so-called new American exceptionalism to take shape. Sullivan states that, quote, reclaiming America's place in the world will be an extraordinary challenge. For decades, the country neglected needed updates to the international system. Now Donald Trump is blowing that system up. The saying goes that when a natural disaster hits, build back better. The same applies to foreign policy. Not since 1945 has the U.S. had the chance to go back to basics and decide which parts to keep, which to scrap, and above all, which to reinvent. After Trump, it can do just that, end quote. It is significant to note that this perceived critical opportunity to reassert the singularity and centrality of the United States via a new American exceptionalism is also described by U.S. journalists as fragile and at great risk of slipping away if the wrong responses to climate change are enacted. This binary of right and wrong, good and bad, limits the possibility for different approaches that are informed by different experiences and perspectives to guide responses to climate change that may lie outside of the United States' limited purview and economic interests. This limited purview impedes a plurality of possible paths forward by casting all who get in the way of this one so-called right path as threatening and anti-American others. This binary is clear and in many ways was a critical point of entrenchment following the widespread media coverage of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in August 2022. The Inflation Reduction Act is a technocratic and top-down policy program that promises federal money to build green energy and green infrastructure projects. It has been heralded by Democratic Party members and centrist media outlets as the most important climate bill to date. And it can't be underestimated as well. But the New York Times and Washington Post, among other legacy presses, for example, ran headlines calling the Inflation Reduction Act historic, and thus as the ultimate endpoints, an achievement following decades of climate activism that climaxed in particular with the recent mass climate movements in the latter half of the 2010s immediately preceding the pandemic. The Inflation Reduction Act, in other words, is represented as the ultimate solution to addressing the climate crisis in a manner that stabilizes the nation and that can serve as a guiding light for the world, leading the way under Biden's leadership as a climate hero and showing the world how to implement a moderate climate solution and build back better, just like after World War II. In stark contrast to the Inflation Reduction Act as a moderate and historic solution, the Green New Deal and young climate justice activists who are critical of the Inflation Reduction Act as not going far enough and as exclusionary in its design and implementation and also very nation-centric, are reported on as fools and misguided and as threatening this historic victory and this clear route back to a sense of national stability and the reclamation of a position of American global leadership. The rampant media fear-mongering of climate justice activists and representation of them as militant others and as a threat to the U.S. ultimately works in favor of the right's political project, and it is often a deliberate strategy used to delay and obstruct any and all climate action. The threat of civilizational collapse is repeatedly leveraged by the right and its allied fossil fuel industry peers to obstruct systemic transformations of the economy and government, including a just transition away from fossil fuel energy. Through narratives of petronationalism, the fossil fuel industry and conservative advocates in the U.S. Congress repeatedly leverage apocalyptic images of civilizational demise to invoke fear and anxiety around the supposed further loss of an American way of life if the U.S. moves too quickly away from oil and gas and towards renewable energy. But the majority of Americans do want a just transition to renewable energy. Notably, however, while a majority does support a just transition to renewable energy, polling also shows that the same majority of people do not think that other Americans share their point of view. Pessimism, in other words, abounds. Collective ties are clearly broken. Collective action is kept at bay, and more democratic modes of governance are kept out of reach when pessimism and distrust of peers and neighbors abound. And the fear-mongering of threatening young militant climate justice warriors across news media only sows more mistrust and severs further remaining social ties. And these social ties have already been weakened over years of neoliberal gutting of public institutions, law and order narratives, post-9/11 terrorist fear-mongering and mass surveillance, and rampant trolling, hate speech, and misinformation circulating online, not to mention the years of isolation, alienation, and anxiety during the COVID-19 pandemic. Clearly, it serves an elite-captured state's best interests to keep collectivities broken, social ties shattered, fears high, and thus the formation of cross-partisan alliances and the organization of collective action at bay, even if this means through police violence and force. At the same time as there is an evident concretization of militant climate justice warrior stereotype across national news media, there's also been a spike in police repression of young climate justice activists on the ground. Through the passage of new critical infrastructure acts in the US, for example, Indigenous and climate protesters who blockade the construction of pipelines are specifically targeted and prosecuted as criminals. Moreover, young climate protesters are being charged with breaking anti-terrorism laws in various nations beyond the US, from Canada to France to Germany to the Philippines and more. Peaceful climate activists worldwide are being imprisoned with lengthy sentences and slapped with steep fines. And as I learned too, since being in Australia, this is also happening here too, with the criminalization of climate activists and protesters. So as the climate justice aligned journalist Amy Westervelt states, quote, "It's troubling to watch the global dehumanization of climate activists, who are often painted as annoying mosquitoes, spoiled brats, or terrorists," end quote. Climate journalism does not need to contribute to this dehumanization. Climate journalism could be different. a reckoning and reimagination of what climate journalism and climate politics could be is required. And this reimagination needs to be actually inclusive and robustly democratic processes of decision making. One thing is clear: apocalyptic authoritarians gain their legitimacy through the construction of a militant versus moderate binary used to justify the forceful suppression of so-called climate justice warriors blamed for present-day chaos. Racialized and gendered tropes are leveraged across climate media to paint an image of threatening young female climate justice activists of color impeding the U.S. from restabilizing and reclaiming its supposedly God-ordained position as an exceptional and glorious nation state, guiding a wayward world towards the right path forward. The binaries of militants versus moderates and American versus anti-American embolden calls for the suppression of an already historically marginalized group of people and advancement of an already historically advantaged few. Fear-mongering and dualisms that legitimize these anti-democratic dynamics of power need to be broken. A reimagined climate journalism capable of contending with and combating apocalyptic authoritarianism, therefore, must center radically divergent subjectivities and engage with, as opposed to fear and fearmonger about, young activists. This is an entirely possible as well as incredibly needed task during this hot moment of anti-democratic and climatic risks. So I will stop there, and hopefully I will figure out how to stop sharing my screen. I assume my screen has stopped being shared, and you can see me and Carrie now.
Yep, it's just you.
Yep. Okay, cool.
Wow. Thank you so much, Hannah, for that refreshing, fine-grained and brilliant analysis of what's happening in the US surrounding climate journalism and that linking of democracy and democratic crises and climate crises with the performance of US journalism. I feel like my sense is, I'm just doing this while people get their questions ready. I'm sure there'll be many. There's plenty of broad brush statements made about media and the way media functions in terms of the climate crisis.
Yeah.
And it's the easy pick, but that scholarly and disciplinary expertise that you've exhibited in your analysis there is and around apocalyptic authoritarianism, which I'll never forget, but it's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
But that was just brilliant. I'm sure that there's and I'm really interested. I'm sure other people on the call are also thinking about how some of your observations resonate in the Australian context as well. I'm sure you're seeing many of them. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks.
Brilliant work, and really looking forward to the book and having a read. And I have been watching over the years, and it's wonderful that all of this work is going to be available in a single volume alongside all your journal articles and your other wonderful work. So what we'll do now is we've enabled cameras and microphones. So if you have a question, if you could put your hand up, then I'll be able to we'll be able to get you to ask your question to Hannah directly. Hi, Michelle Dyer. Please ask your question.
Could I jump in? Because there's always a lag. Can you guys hear me all right? My sound might be delayed. Is that okay?
It's a little delayed, but I can hear you.
Okay. Thanks so much, Hannah. That was fascinating. And my question might be a bit naive because I'm not an ex-journalist or from any media background. But I just wondered, you did mention some age-related stuff to do with who is being demonised and the old white male. I also just wondered, does your work show, or is there work around this on what younger generations perceive as media and journalism? I'm specifically thinking about, obviously how a lot of people, particularly younger people, don't read any traditional or conventional media outlets, and all their media comes through various social media platforms. So I just wondered, did you have any commentary on what's happening in that bubble as opposed to this bubble with the conventional media forms?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you so much for that. And yes, so this project was primarily looking at traditional journalism. So the object of study being traditional journalism and the national press in the US, because of the importance of that in terms of the discourse around what is understood as being the definition of climate change and then legitimizing certain official responses or not. And a lot of critiques of climate journalism, focusing on the question of there not being enough or the quantity, as opposed to doing a deep dive into what is actually being reported on. And there's many, many studies that actually are doing deep dives into what's reported on, but in particular, me seeing this real shift in 2016 and the actual beginning of a climate beat in 2019 in the US. So I did focus in on that in particular. But my next project that I'm working on actually is looking at how climate justice activists, young climate justice activists, are responding to these negative stereotypes that are circulating in mainstream media and how they are forming their own narratives and representations, but also the challenges for doing that because, as we all know, for example, Elon Musk buying Twitter and that being historically a really important space for climate movements and climate justice activists to convene and to counter mainstream media coverage and to build their own organizing and to really have this alternative space to think through different problems and actually keep each other going and motivated. That has largely been threatened because of just this purchase of this platform by just one person, and then there being a question of, well, where can we go? Where are we going from? Where can we convene? And so that's what I'm looking at, seeing this disruption of digital spaces and where climate justice activists are moving to, or if they're creating alternative spaces to create their own media or to contest media. But right now it's really, a little confusing for a lot of folks in terms of where to go. And so there still is a reliance on national media and these news sources. And a lot of times, New York Times articles, for example, are still cited and used by climate justice movements. And then it's a question of, well, New York Times doesn't have the best interests sometimes of these young activists. And there's this it's a really complicated thing, but I don't think that at this moment, national media can be discounted because of this disruption and uncertainty around where to actually find alternative perspectives and where to convene. So it was a long answer, but yes, I am thinking it through, and it's really interesting to think about. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mish. Thanks for that response, Hanna. Ross, you have a question for Hanna.
Morning. Can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
Hi. No, I just popped into the chat. So this is the Guardian's reporting of basically human-induced climate change and the age-old debate that shouldn't be a debate because it's scientific. I was just inquiring as to where you see the role of media, looking at, say, the top one that's Brazil, Colombia, all these countries probably experiencing some, real climate impacts on livelihoods, and then Australia having an even lower rate of acceptance than the US, and the role, I guess, of media and whether that is just your Fox and all that kind of stuff, or sorry, not Fox, what's it called? Anyway, the Murdoch press and so forth. So just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of that same model that you've explored in the US and comparing it to Australia.
So this graph is...
Can I help?
Yeah.
Ross, actually, if you read through that article, you'll see that Griffith Climate Action Survey is quoted towards the end of that piece, and the Climate of the Nation survey. And it's an excellent example of the way, actually, of some of the points that Hanna's making around climate journalism. So the question that was about the disruption question, this is the question that appeared in the survey as some indication of where we're going with this. The question that was asked of the respondents was this one. In your opinion, is action and investment in supporting ecological transformation in your country commensurate with the risk that pollution, climate disruption and depletion of natural resources poses to your health and quality of life? There's some really serious issues there around, the way in which a question is poised, which I'll put to and some serious issues around the way in which The Guardian has reported that also, and the findings of the National Climate Action Survey, which we're just finalising the 2023 results. So in thinking about Hanna's presentation today, if I may, in the context of having participated actually in that article that you put up, the way in which climate journalism has seized the opportunity to talk about about climate disruption, if any of the respondents even understood that that's what they were responding to, I think is on point in terms of Hanna's presentation and analysis of US climate journalism, and I'd also direct you to the eventually to the Climate Action Survey 2023 results, which show in fact that that's not the case at all. And if it were, that's certainly not the question that we'd ask. But over to you, Hanna.
Well, that's pretty sad too, right?
I think it's frustrating, at the very least, that the opportunity to look at the Australian surveys that have more context and more nuanced understanding of Australian climate change, but also just in terms of methodology and survey questions. I think that's a doozy, as we might say, the technical term, a doozy of a question that I would be cautious to report upon to a national audience for sure.
Yeah. That's I don't really have anything to add, because I think that answers the question, but I think, interesting, thinking through different journalistic tools that maybe need to be, rethought a bit, and the way questions are asked, or,
and how you frame data. Wonderful. Debbie Firestone from the Tweed Shire Council. Debbie. I think you're on mute, Debbie. You're on mute, Deb. No, absolutely on mute.
How about now?
Yes, that's good.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much for your presentation, Hanna, particularly the slide about the pessimism that people feel about how isolated, I guess, they are in their feelings about climate change. And it really struck me that how important it is that we use local data about, community attitudes to climate change. And, so grateful to have worked with Climate Action Beacon in the Tweed to gather local data to that point. But I'm interested if your research has identified other antidotes or ways of countering that that sense of isolation or pessimism.
Oh, that's such a great question. That's something that really interests me a lot too, just this question, especially seeing how in this period when Trump was elected and living in the US at the time, and this moment of real rupture and crisis, but then also the real kind of moment where there was a lot of different existing climate and social justice groups that came together, and they saw this as, we need to do something, and came together, and the Green New Deal came out of that, and it created this awareness and this visibility, this high visibility that there are others that also were concerned and wanted this vision for what the US could be like. And, that unfortunately with the pandemic happening pretty much right when there was this peak moment where there was a lot of support and solidarity and movement building and on the ground action and seeing others and being among others, there was this real disruption of that. And I think that the pandemic did a lot more damage than maybe we're even aware of or thinking through in terms of breaking up that sense of, optimism in a way, or realizing that there are others who care. And I don't know if there's been a recovery of that in the climate justice movement, especially my answer to the other question too, of there's not even online spaces to see that connection with others, because there's been a real fragmentation and confusion about where to go with the concentrated ownership of tech platforms and not wanting to support that and trying to build alternative spaces, but then you don't really have a common place to convene and to show each other that you care. So in my research I am looking at that, and I that's where I'm focusing on the historical kind of method and seeing these points where there's been what's happened in recent history that has created this pessimism or entrenched this pessimism. And that's what I'm looking through and thinking about. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's just what came to my mind.
That's great. Thanks, Deb, for the question. And again, in the climate action survey, called action because it's, looking at, the ways in which populations are changing, and the Australian population as well. And we certainly know that on the Tweed, don't we, Deb? Especially in the wake of disaster events. And so 2019 here was about, the catastrophic Australian bushfires, and then we hardly had a chance to respond, and we were in the COVID pandemic, as is your observations, Hanna. So there's certainly, I guess, innovation, progression in the Australian public that isn't necessarily captured by, do you believe in climate change or not? Things happening. Okay, and Lindsay, please, question from you. Lovely.
Hi. Thank you. Hi, how you going? One of the things that occurs to me whenever you look at media coverage is the narratives that people go to after natural disasters that are climate related. So in Australia is, floods, bushfires, cyclone, sea level rise, coastal erosion and so forth. And the media's focus on those who have lost and their spirit in rebuilding and so forth. But the fundamental underlying issues of the value of assets and that they're uninsurable in certain parts, and the cost of reacting to climate change is rising and becoming out of reach for a lot of asset owners. That media's lack of focus in that area and the willingness to tell stories but not to look at the underlying economic changes that are occurring. Do you see that resistance in the media as common around the world, or is it in particular pockets of interest groups where you see that occurring?
Where you see that there is more coverage of economic underlying context, or if I see that in media coverage?
Yeah, in Australia, for example, you tend to need to go to SBS and ABC to get that kind of lens on the issues, whereas the commercial media gives scant regard. Yeah, it's a really important question, and I might be taking this in another direction besides what you had in mind, but what came to my mind in your question and what I have a chapter dedicated in my book, I look at how there is the creation of sort of this inevitability, or this idea that there's inevitably going to be a group of usually poor, usually people of color, people in the global south that are just going to be, victims of climate change, are going to be lost.
And there's this, in this way of developing stories, there's this sort of assumption and embedded in a discursive way of creating these articles, this almost, this claim of inevitability, that there's a group that's going to be saved and a group that's going to be lost. And that overshadows, what you're saying in terms of the increasingly, lack of insurance available to whole classes of people. That does not need to be inevitable. That's a political decision that's made. It's an economic and political decision that's made. It does not need to happen. There can be interventions made. So it's not inevitable that there's going to be this extreme inequality in terms of how to respond. But I've noticed, and why I dedicate a whole chapter to it in my book, is that even stories that focus on climate justice and these issues of inequity and looking at the fundamental economic inequality that leads to different experiences of climate change, there is still this binary created, and again, this almost hubris in reporting from the US perspective, saying that we're going to choose who to save. We can, on reporting on other places, and also stories are in the global South, there's this reporting saying, the US, we can choose to save them. It's acknowledgement, we created the problem, but we can choose who to save, and totally glossing over, it's very problematic. So even stories that grapple with climate justice still, in a lot of ways, overlook these underlying economic structures and very particular material decisions that are made, and just make it seem like it's inevitable that there's going to be some that are saved, some that aren't, and the US is automatically a part of the saved. But then within the US, there's some that aren't saved, and those are the others that don't, deserve to be saved. And so there's this very strange narrative structure that I've noted in a lot of climate journalism. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that is what came to my mind.
It's an interesting question, I think, too, Hannah. Climate change journalism beyond disaster and crisis, and that and the way in which that apocalyptic narrative performs around, I think it's Judeo-Christian values around, the descent of some force. The saved. Yeah, that's right. So that's in terms of I'm thinking about news values and how we how journalists and news media publications respond to news values of crisis and disaster, and things like Lindsay have raised a struggle for front page, don't they? Have we got any other questions? Okay, then I'll ask a question. Oh, hang on, Lindsay's typing. What's the current sort of state of play with young people and climate or environmental protests in the US at the moment? So has there been anything noteworthy lately around the way in which US journalism is, as a broad category, traditional journalism, is responding to youth and climate and environmental protests?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I think, there's been in the past, since October, a real entrenchment of some ways of grouping young protesters together as threatening or destabilizing. And the real, clearly reactionary responses to a lot of protests happening that are being picked up and used in narrative structures and reporting. So climate activists and who are aligning themselves, for example, with pro-Palestine movements are in particular being really honed in on and othered in that way, and not engaged with, and in maybe more nuanced way. So it's an interesting moment right now where there seems to be a really clearly this mode of othering of all protesters together. And from what I've noted in my study, it really coming out in a very clear way. So that, I don't know if that answered that felt like a confusing response to your question. But
no, I would think, and others might on the call might have their own observations, but I would certainly say the same is true in Australia also of Extinction Rebellion, especially when they've blocked bridges and stopped people from getting home from their commute, or those other more acute moments of climate and environmental protest. Although they're not always young people but I would mostly associate it with young people, just climate activists, I guess.
Yeah, there's actually, it just reminds me, because yesterday so I'm here for another conference too, and so there's one of the conference sessions, there was, and this is a common kind of theme that comes up, or question of, if there's more quote-unquote extreme forms of protests like the Extinction Rebellion, or protesters that are occupying public space, does that make it then seem like, it brings more negotiation potential for other types of climate action that seem as more moderate in comparison, But then I worry about that because of what I've seen with my research, but then that delegitimizes a whole group of people that could be cast as a part of that extreme group. Or, if you're seen as being like a young progressive woman of color, then maybe there's a stereotype that you're extreme, and so you shouldn't be considered, and we need to only talk with these moderates. And so that strategy maybe, and so how do we figure out how to move beyond binaries of extreme and moderate is what I'm really interested in.
Yeah, and how if you are if you're critical of the extreme, how you may well be playing into that, into the right play.
So how do you critique extreme? How can you? There's a real, it's challenging for how to have critique in this moment, because it could just be co-opted or used by the right to further delegitimize all kinds of protests
and all kinds of responses to climate that might disrupt established corridors of power. And now we've got a question from Debbie whilst we've been musing. Let's go down here. And yet the nature of the issue requires extreme responses, and that's find that's absolutely true, Deb. But finding a platform when something really, thanks, Mish. Finding a platform where what is extreme really should be quite moderate, given the urgency, given the insights from our climate science friends and colleagues. Finding and this is really, I guess, one of the things that the Climate Action Beacon and we are always dealing with as people who straddle across the STEM disciplines and the humanities, arts and social sciences is, the problem isn't the ecosystem, the problem is the relationship between the social system and the ecosystem. And, when our social system is so reliant on media, and media is a part of, our daily bread, if I may, Judeo-Christian once again.
You see, it's hard to escape.
Yeah, it's hard to escape. It is. I'm there too. All right. Okay. Any further questions or comments? Happy to take either. There we go.
Thanks for the nice comments in the chat. I'm reading them now.
Is there anything you'd like to say finally?
I just want to say thank you so much for your attention and time and engagement. I really appreciate it, and thank you to Carrie for the space to do this. And hopefully you'll enjoy the book when it comes out. Hopefully next spring is a plan. So it's supposed to be spring 2025 release.
Yeah, great. And thank you, Hanna, of course, for making the effort. And, that a paper like that is years and years of work and thinking. So, congratulations and thank you for doing such important work and for sharing it with our audience. So, this session's been recorded, so it'll be available online. So, encourage you to revisit or send others to the chat and look out for the next Climate Action Beacon webinar next month. But other than that, I think thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time.